She stood on the asphalt shoulder of the highway, the rain plastering her white shirt to her skin, turning the cheap fabric translucent and cold. The red vest, usually a symbol of her employment at the Onyx Lounge, now felt like a heavy, sodden target painted on her back. Mary shivered, clutching a cardboard box that was disintegrating in her hands, the bottom threatening to fall out and spill her meager possessions: a spare pair of comfortable shoes, a half-empty bottle of lotion, and a framed photograph of her mother, into the roadside mud. Just 20 minutes earlier, she had been the most efficient server on the floor, balancing 3 trays of champagne while navigating the chaotic Friday night dinner rush. Now she was a statistic, an unemployed immigrant woman walking home in a thunderstorm because she couldn't afford the cab fare that would cut into next week's grocery budget. The headlights of passing cars blinded her, momentary flashes of brilliance that only made the returning darkness feel heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't just that she had lost her job, it was the way it had happened. The memory was still stinging fresh, playing on a loop in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The incident had been trivial, a mistake made by a drunk patron who had grabbed her arm, causing a tray of red wine to cascade over the pristine white tablecloth of table 4. But Mr. Henderson didn't care about context. He cared about the stain. Henderson, the manager who wore cheap cologne and expensive ties, had descended upon the scene not to help, but to execute. The dining room had gone silent, the clinking of silverware halting as all eyes turned to witness the spectacle. Mary had tried to speak, to explain that the man had stumbled, but Henderson had raised a manicured hand, cutting the air like a knife. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the power he held over her livelihood. "You are clumsy, you are unrefined, and you are finished," he had hissed, loud enough for the VIP section to hear, his voice dripping with that specific brand of cruelty reserved for those who believe they are untouchable. He stripped her of her dignity before he stripped her of her badge, demanding she leave immediately, mid-shift, without her tips. There was no severance, no discussion, just the sharp, stinging eviction from the world of the employed into the cold, wet reality of the streets. The walk was grueling, a physical manifestation of her internal despair. Every step Mary took in her black work trousers, which were now soaked to the knees, felt like walking through quicksand. The wind howled, whipping her braided hair against her face, stinging her eyes. She wasn't crying. She had promised herself long ago, when she left her home country to build a life here, that she wouldn't cry over jobs that didn't love her back, but the rain did a good job of mimicking tears. She passed the glowing neon signs of liquor stores and closed pawn shops, the city's underbelly exposed by the storm. She thought about the rent due in 3 days. She thought about the text message she had sent her sister earlier that morning, promising that money was on the way. The shame burned hotter than the freezing rain. She was 28 years old, educated, capable, and yet she was reduced to walking the breakdown lane because a man with a fragile ego decided she was disposable. The world felt vast and indifferent, a gray expanse of concrete and water that cared nothing for her struggle. Inside the Onyx Lounge, life had likely resumed. The wine would be mopped up, the table reset, and another server would be enduring Henderson's tyranny. Mary felt a phantom ache in her feet, the muscle memory of a 12-hour shift that had been cut short. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled from the rain and calloused from hard work. These hands had healed wounds, cooked meals, and carried the weight of her family's expectations, but to the world, they were just the hands of a fired waitress. A sudden gust of wind nearly knocked her into the path of an oncoming truck, the horn blaring a long, angry note that faded into the distance. She steadied herself, hugging the wet cardboard box tighter against her chest. It was the only anchor she had left. The isolation was profound. In this moment, Mary felt truly invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a society that consumed her labor and discarded her humanity. She kept her head down, counting her steps, trying to calculate how many miles were left until she reached the safety of her small, drafty apartment. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. It was a physical alteration of the air pressure around her. The sound of the rain was suddenly drowned out by a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in her chest. It started as a distant hum, something she mistook for thunder, but it grew rapidly into a deafening roar that shook the puddles on the ground. The wind picked up, but this wasn't the natural gale of the storm. This was distinct, mechanical, and violent. Mary stopped, shielding her eyes against the downpour, looking up into the swirling gray clouds. A searchlight, blindingly bright, pierced through the gloom, sweeping across the wet asphalt until it locked onto her. She froze, terrified. Was this the police? Immigration? Had Henderson called the authorities to escalate his cruelty? The thumping grew louder, a percussive beat that rattled her teeth. Out of the darkness, a sleek, black helicopter materialized, its rotors slicing through the rain with terrifying precision. It was a military-grade machine, looking like a predator descending from the sky. It wasn't hovering over the highway. It was banking hard, heading straight for the parking lot of the Onyx Lounge, just a few hundred yards behind her. The sheer audacity of the maneuver caused cars on the highway to slam on their brakes, creating a chaotic snarl of traffic. Mary watched in stunned silence as the bird of prey touched down in the center of the VIP lot, kicking up a tornado of water, dust, and debris. The expensive cars of the restaurant patrons were buffeted by the wash, their alarms triggering in a cacophony of panic. This wasn't a medical extraction. This was an invasion. The force of the landing blew the sign of the restaurant sideways. Inside, she could see the silhouette of the dining room erupt into chaos, patrons pressing their faces against the glass, witnessing a scene straight out of an action movie. The side door of the helicopter slid open before the skids even fully settled on the pavement. Figures in dark tactical gear poured out, moving with the synchronized lethality of a special forces unit. They fanned out, securing a perimeter around the aircraft, their movement sharp and professional. They ignored the rain. They ignored the screaming car alarms. They were waiting for someone. Mary, paralyzed on the side of the road, watched as a final figure emerged. He didn't wear tactical gear. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than the restaurant itself. He stepped onto the wet pavement with a calm, terrifying authority, ignoring the rotor wash that whipped his long dark coat around his legs. It was Jason. The recognition hit Mary like a physical blow. She hadn't seen him in 6 months, not since the night she had found him bleeding in the alley behind her old diner job and, against all common sense, had stitched him up and fed him soup instead of calling the cops. He looked different now, healthier, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. Mr. Henderson, seemingly unable to resist the proximity to power, came running out of the restaurant's back in trance, a busboy holding an umbrella over his head that immediately turned inside out. Henderson looked frantic, his face a mask of obsequious panic. He clearly thought this was a VIP guest, perhaps a billionaire or a foreign dignitary who had decided to drop in for dinner. He rushed toward the perimeter, waving his arms, shouting something that was lost in the roar of the engines. He was trying to bow and direct traffic at the same time, a pathetic display of servitude. Mary saw Jason stop. He turned slowly toward Henderson. Even from this distance, the body language was clear. Jason was the apex predator, and Henderson was a noisy insect. The bodyguards stepped aside, allowing the two men to face each other in the pouring rain. Mary took a step forward, drawn by a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. She needed to see this. She needed to understand why the man she had saved was descending from the sky like a vengeance god. Jason didn't shout. He didn't need to. The quiet menace of his presence was enough to silence the storm itself. He stared at Henderson, who was now babbling, pointing at the restaurant, offering the best table in the house. Jae-sun simply raised a hand, and one of his guards stepped forward, shoving a terrified Henderson back a step. The Korean crime lord looked around, scanning the area with eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the restaurant, then at the terrified staff huddled in the doorway. He looked displeased. He looked furious. Then, his voice cut through the noise, amplified by the sheer force of his command. "Where is the waitress?" he demanded. The words were simple, but the tone suggested that the wrong answer would result in the building being leveled. Henderson blinked, confused. He stammered, looking back at his staff. "Waitress? We have many. Table 5? The blonde." Jae-sun stepped closer, invading Henderson's personal space until the manager was trembling. "The one in the red vest," Jae-sun clarified, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The one with the hands that heal. Where is she?" Henderson went pale. The realization dawned on him. The woman he had just thrown out like garbage was the object of this powerful man's search.
Panic set in. She
was let go.
just now.
Incompetent. She left. Henderson pointed vaguely toward the dark highway, trying to distance himself from his own action. "She walked that way. She's nobody." The look on Jae-sun's face shifted from irritation to a cold, focused rage. He looked in the direction Henderson pointed, his eyes narrowing as they pierced the darkness. The searchlight from the helicopter swung around, following his gaze, sweeping the road until it illuminated Mary. She stood frozen in the beam of light, soaking wet, the red vest vivid against the gray night. Jae-sun didn't wait. He didn't check for traffic. He simply started walking toward her, moving with a singular, intense purpose. He ignored Henderson, ignored the rain, ignored the armed guards who scrambled to keep up. He walked straight through the mud, his expensive shoes ruining, his eyes locked onto hers. As he closed the distance, the hardness in Jae-sun's face began to fracture, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. He wasn't just a mafia boss coming to collect a debt. He was a man who had been searching. When he reached her, he stopped inches away, oblivious to the water running down his face. Mary looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was shivering uncontrollably now, a mix of cold and adrenaline. Jae-sun looked at the soggy box in her hands, then at her tear-streaked face. His expression darkened with a protective fury that made her knees weak. "I told you I would find you," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, an intimate rumble amidst the chaos. "Why are you walking in the rain, Mary?" He said her name like it was a prayer he had been memorizing. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently took the heavy, wet box from her trembling fingers and handed it to a guard without looking away from her eyes. "I was fired," she whispered, the reality of it feeling absurd in the face of this cinematic madness. "Mr. Henderson," he said, "I wasn't good enough." Jae-sun's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and took it off, draping the warm, heavy fabric over her shoulders. It smelled of sandalwood and gunpowder. "He is a fool who will be dealt with," Jae-sun stated, tucking the lapels around her to shield her from the wind. "But his mistake is my fortune. I need you, Mary. Not for charity. I have a situation. A negotiation tonight that requires trust. And I trust no one else to pour my wine. I trust no one else to watch my back." He looked at her with an intensity that transcended the professional. This wasn't just about service, it was about survival. He offered her his hand, palm up, the rain pooling in it. "Come with me. Leave this place. You will never walk home in the rain again." Mary looked at his hand, then back at the restaurant where Henderson stood watching in horror. She looked at the red vest she was wearing, the symbol of her servitude, and then at the man offering her a kingdom. She took his hand. The roar of the helicopter rotors intensified as Mary placed her hand in Jae-sun's, the contact sending a jolt of warmth through her freezing arm that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. He pulled her up with an effortless strength, guiding her off the rain-slicked asphalt and onto the metal step of the aircraft. As she climbed into the cabin, the world she knew, the world of minimum wage, aching feet, and Mr. Henderson's sneering face, began to fall away. She collapsed onto the plush leather bench seat, the sudden luxury jarring against her soaked uniform. A crew member immediately slid the heavy door shut, sealing out the storm and the noise, replacing the chaotic din with a muffled, pressurized hum. Jae-sun sat opposite her, his dark eyes scanning her face for signs of shock. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached into a compartment and pulled out a thick, cashmere blanket, leaning forward to wrap it around her shoulders over his own suit jacket. The intimacy of the gesture, performed in front of his armed guards who stared stoically ahead, made her breath catch. She looked out the rain-streaked window and saw the onyx lounge shrinking below, a glowing box of misery that was rapidly disappearing into the dark tapestry of the city. Henderson was just a speck now, a microscopic tyrant in a kingdom of asphalt, while she was ascending. Jae-sun handed her a headset, his voice coming through clear and calm, cutting through the static in her mind. "We are 5 minutes out," he said, not to the pilot, but to her. "Mary, I apologize for the theatrics. But time was a luxury I did not have. Tonight is the Red Dragon Summit. The heads of the 3 families are meeting to discuss territory. It is a dinner, a peace offering. But peace is often just a pause between wars." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "They will have their own servers, their own tasters. I cannot trust them. I need someone who understands the flow of a room, someone who can spot a threat before it happens. I remembered how you stitched my side in that alley with a sewing kit and vodka. I remembered how you noticed the shadow of the man who stabbed me before he even moved. You have the eyes of a survivor. Tonight, I need those eyes." The helicopter banked sharply, the city lights tilting on a vertical axis, revealing a towering spire of glass and steel that pierced the cloud layer, the Skyline Sovereign Hotel. This was the venue, a neutral ground for the city's most dangerous men. They landed on the rooftop helipad, the wind whipping around them as the doors slid open. This time, however, Mary didn't feel the cold. She felt a surging sense of purpose. She was ushered not into a kitchen or a service entrance, but into a private penthouse suite that served as a staging area. A team of stylists and tailors was waiting, but Jae-sun waved them off with a sharp command in Korean. "No," he said, turning to Mary. "Keep the vest. Keep the shirt. Clean them, dry them, but do not change who you are. They expect me to bring a model or a silent servant in silk. I am bringing a professional." He wanted her to look like exactly what she was, a worker. It was a power move, a statement that he valued competence over aesthetics. Mary stood before a floor-to-length mirror while an assistant quickly blow-dried her shirt and pressed the wrinkles from her red vest. She looked at her reflection. The exhaustion was still there, etched around her eyes. But the fear was gone. She adjusted her collar. The same motion she had done 1,000 times before a shift, but this time the stakes weren't tips. They were lives. She watched Jae-sun check a firearm before tucking it into his waistband and buttoning his fresh jacket. He caught her eye in the mirror. "Just pour the wine, Mary," he said softly. "And watch the hands." "Always watch the hands," she nodded. The training of a decade in high-pressure dining rooms merging with the adrenaline of the moment. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an asset. The summit took place in a private dining room that felt more like a vault than a restaurant. The walls were lined with soundproof velvet, and the only light came from a massive crystal chandelier and the panoramic view of the storm-lashed city below. 3 men sat at a round table, each accompanied by a silent bodyguard standing in the shadows. There was Mr. Tanaka, an elderly man with fingers missing on his left hand, Sergei, a massive Russian whose breathing whistled through a broken nose, and Jae-sun, who took his seat with the predatory grace of a panther. Mary stood by the sideboard, where a bottle of Chateau Margaux 1996 had been decanted. The air in the room was so thick with tension it felt viscous. She moved with a silent, rhythmic efficiency she had perfected over years of dodging kitchen collisions. She approached the table, the bottle cradled in her hand, a white napkin draped over her forearm. As she poured for Tanaka, she noticed the way his bodyguard shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. She poured for Sergei, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass. Not fear, but withdrawal or anticipation. Then she moved to Jae-sun. As she poured the ruby liquid, she saw it. A subtle glance from Sergei's bodyguard toward the service entrance, a microscopic nod. It wasn't part of the service flow. It was a signal. Mary didn't flinch. She finished pouring, gave the bottle a perfect quarter turn to prevent a drip, and stepped back into the shadows. But she didn't retreat to her station. She moved slightly to the left, positioning herself between the service door and Jae-sun, pretending to adjust a stack of plates. Her senses were dialed to 11. She could hear the ice melting in the buckets, the leather creaking, the heartbeat of the man next to her. The conversation at the table was polite, coded in metaphors about shipping lanes and construction permits, but the violence was bubbling just beneath the surface. Sergei raised his glass for a toast. To new partnerships, he rumbled, his voice like gravel. And to the end of old grievances, it was the cue. Mary saw the service door handle turn, too slowly. A server wouldn't be that tentative. Simultaneously, Sergei's hand dropped below the table, not toward his napkin, but toward his ankle. The timing was synchronized. Without a conscious thought, Mary acted. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She grabbed a heavy silver water pitcher from the sideboard and, with the precision of a major league pitcher, hurled it not at the men, but at the massive crystal centerpiece in the middle of the table. The collision was deafening. Glass exploded outward, water sprayed everywhere, and the sudden, shocking chaos broke the psychological lock in the room. In that split second of distraction, Jae-sun was moving. He saw what Mary had seen, Sergei's drop, and he lunged across the table, pinning the Russian's hand before he could draw the weapon taped to his calf. The service door burst open, and a gunman rushed in, but he hesitated, confused by the shattered centerpiece and the water. That hesitation cost him his life. Jae-sun's guards dropped him before he cleared the threshold. The room froze. Silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the dripping of water from the table. Jae-sun stood over Sergei, a steak knife pressed against the Russian's carotid artery. But his eyes were on Mary. She stood calmly by the wall, hands clasped behind her back, her red vest spotless amidst the wreckage. "My apologies for the clumsy service," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the violence. "I believed there was a fly on the table." The aftermath was a blur of rapid-fire negotiations, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Sergei was escorted out in disgrace, his territory forfeit. Tanaka, impressed by the audacity of the countermove, pledged his allegiance to Jae-sun. But the true victory came an hour later, back on the ground. The rain had stopped, leaving the city scoured clean. The helicopter touched down again in the parking lot of the Onyx Lounge. It was 2 a.m., but the lights were still on. Jae-sun walked Mary to the front door, his guards flanking them like a royal escort. He pushed the doors open. The staff was cleaning up, and Henderson was in the office, counting out the till. When he saw Jae-sun and Mary, he nearly swallowed his tongue. He stood up, knocking over his chair. "Sir, I didn't expect." Jae-sun ignored him, walking straight to the middle of the room. He snapped his fingers, and a lawyer in a sharp gray suit stepped forward, placing a document on the nearest table. "Mr. Henderson," Jae-sun said, his voice echoing in the empty restaurant. I have just purchased the building and the land. And the debt this business carries. Henderson turned the color of old milk. Purchased?
But
Why? Jason turned to Mary, gesturing to her with an open hand. Because you fired the only person who knows how to run this room. You fired the woman who saved my life twice. Once with a needle and once with a pitcher of water. He stepped closer to Henderson, looming over him. You are relieved of your command. Get out. Take your box. And if I ever see you near the city again, I will not be as polite. Mary watched as Henderson, stripped of his arrogance, scrambled to gather his things, shoving staplers and pens into a plastic bag, the mirror image of her own exit hours earlier. As he shuffled out the door, the remaining staff, busboys, bartenders, dishwashers, slowly started to clap. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a raucous, vindictive applause that grew into a cheer. 1 year later, the Onyx Lounge was gone. In its place stood the Red Vest, the city's most exclusive supper club. The line to get in wrapped around the block every Friday night. Inside, the lighting was warm, the music was jazz, and the service was impeccable. Mary moved through the room not as a server, but as the owner. She wore a tailored red suit, a nod to her past, but the fabric was silk and the cut was Italian. She stopped at table 4, the table where she had been fired, and poured a glass of champagne for a regular. She smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the room. Up on the mezzanine, watching from his private booth, sat Jason. They weren't just partners in business. The ring on her finger caught the light as she gestured to the staff. He raised his glass to her, and she winked back. She had built a sanctuary where competence was rewarded and loyalty was currency. She walked to the front of the house, looking out the window at the dry, safe street. She wasn't walking anymore. She was flying. And that brings us to you. We've all had a Henderson in our lives, someone who couldn't see our value because they were blinded by their own insecurity. But remember Mary's walk in the rain. The moment you think it's over, the moment you're holding that wet cardboard box, might just be the moment the helicopter is landing. Don't let the storm stop you. Keep walking, keep your head up, and be ready when your moment comes. Because true skill can't be fired. It can only be promoted. Subscribe if you're ready for your life to be changed forever, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that their rainy night is about to end.